Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANs processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to. From emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. That was a beautiful rendition of the disclaimer. Thank you.
Oh, except for one small little detail. And that is that my screen is not up. Oh my God. So let's see if this will work.
Yeah, there it is. Now we see your opening screen. Yes, perfect. It does take a bit of time to get used to, but I think you've gotten it.
Okay. You know, some programmers is going to have to put in an emoji or something like with a handle so that we can get a handle on it. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the Kesh American Knowledge Team meeting, and it's another beautiful Sunday afternoon, and hopefully adults have come into the building. And I want to thank all for being here and making this such an important meeting, because there are many, many very important events going on at this point in time. Generally speaking, probably some of the most important times in the last 100 years. It is not an overstatement. This is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We're discussing the intermediate transmutation. And yes, today I have made up a word, Massamatics. And my name is Alexander. I'm from Canada. It is October the 27th, 2024. This is the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we're discussing intermediate transmutation, and it's a continuation of a lot of intermediate series going now for 4 years. And we are trying to figure out what's going on in this y-axis sphere, and how the bonding is affecting Last week it was tensity, and today is Massamatics. Please understand, even though these are intermediate teachings, they are still very, very basics. And one of the reasons that I've chosen this name is because not all of us are rocket scientists, and not all of us are plasma physicists, and not all of us have gone to that school where we can have a PhD. So most of us are on the hesitancy highway. We're walking with the lowest energy state, and we're just sitting on the donkeys trying to cross this bonding highway. And we see, well, we may need 2 tents for the evening, but we see ourselves, despite the fact that we're on the lowest energy state, as masters of the universe. Yes, because we're searching for outer space, aren't we? So we can beat the mass exodus onto the plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. And will there be a mass exodus? And this is one of the questions that we ask, and it sounds like a strange question. If you leave, will you want to come back? Well, how much of a burning desire do you have to leave? And if you're going to leave, where are you going to go? And is where you're going to go better than where you are? And so many questions. But one of the things that is common is that our existence is based on our mass, and our mass has to take a lot of things into account. So these are all discussed in the books of Maren Tavakolik Kesh. Book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter, the bringing together the matter, dark matter, and antimatter. And please remember that there are many people who have no idea what we're talking about, and this is as new can be. And to talk about book number 2, The Structure of the Light, this is already confounding to a lot of people, and to understand that the light has to go from one matter to another matter. And at some point in book number 3, you have the origin of the universe. And so that matter breaks up into 2 universes, our universe and the sister universe. And this picture that shows 2 different fields is probably one of the most difficult things to understand. And what we have to understand is, where are these fields exactly in our science? And so what we find is, of course, our universe is what we're concerned about in our science. But our science ignores the rest. And that's where the problem happens. Because as we're talking about for 349 weeks in a row with Rick Crammon and the Universal Council, trying to put forward the notion of one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. And the reason for this is because justice and world peace is our ticket to joining the universal community, because that is exactly how they operate. So this is not lip service. This is the reality. And so the 10 Commandments are not lip service, but they're part of a fundamental ethos that is all throughout the universe. And for some reason, we have an exception here. And the reason for it is because we're not operating on the plasma highway. We're trying to get on that. And so we see the relationship with carbon. We're talking about a lot more about that today. But we have to understand that we are in the carbon 12 zone, which is the transmission highway. And so as part of that, we have frequency, and we have pressure, and we have heat. But when we get into the transition highway, those frequency, pressure, and heat are not relevant. And so this transition highway is somewhere off the beaten path, shall we say, but that is actually not true. It is very much part of the beaten path, because all paths go through the transition highway. And then, of course, there's the transmutation highway, which is the highway that we all want to get on. And we think we're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. So let's see how we get there. We understand our little MAGRAPH pie chart, and we see that the computer has a mind of its own. Sorry. The MAGRAPH pie chart as the speed of light is the constant transmission. So that notion has led us to believe that it's also the fastest transmission. We found that not to be true. But even though the light is constant, we find that it has a variable transition because we have different colors. And so when we talk about our little pie, is the speed of light just a component, a little piece of that pie? And well, which piece of that pie is it? And why is the universe light years away? And why don't we have that pie? And so is it possible that we are disconnected, or are we conflicted in a zone between the affinity and the prejudice? And I think the prejudice seems to stand out because, let's face it, we were born here and we were happy to be born here because it's a lot nicer here than it is on Mars. And yet we seem to make a mess of things. And that is a choice. And as such, it's also a relationship choice. So we found that as part of the transmission, we actually need to do this transmission in 3 dimensions. And of course, then we have to figure out how do we transition to the various dimensions. And then we find that, well, we have to transition in 3 dimensions. And so here we are trying to analyze the relationship between the X and the Y axis, which are part of the transmutation dimension. And we find that we're still talking about the medium, and it's different from the message. So our medium has to be somehow in the singularity, but it's a singularity of the medium. So we're not taking enough into account. So we've been talking extensively about surface to volume ratios, and we disclosed one of the most important things last week, the tensity as it relates to the surface to volume ratio and what it means. And so we find that when we say that 1 and 1 is more than 2, 1 and 1 doesn't mean it's the same one. And there's a lot of other things it doesn't mean. So we just, generally speaking, you take one and you take another and you will get more than 2. But how much more than 2? So first of all, we have to understand that in the process of balancing feeding dimensions and feedback dimensions, we don't lose the original one. They have to keep feeding. So whether it's one, keep feeding, and the other one, keep feeding, both of them have to keep feeding. And so they are dependent on the feedback, and a result of that, they become also part of the feedback dimensions because they react to the feedback. So the feedback adjusts the feeding. So the feeding doesn't always come at the same volume, does it? Just the same way you adjust the music on your speakers. It's not always at full blast, is it? Unless you're on some kind of enhancement. But where do we sit? We seem to be this observer fudger, because we're not part of these 3 dimensions. We're observing these dimensions, and they have so much variety, and yet, we're just going to round it off and say, pi is 3.14. Well, you know what? It's basically 3. And So we'll just fudge the rest. And we've gone through life with that fudging. But the fact of the matter is, we don't operate in a singularity. We operate in a duality, which means that all things have to be balanced. And so when we're looking at the left side and the right side, there has to be a balance. When we're looking at the components of the left and the right side, we find that there is a magnetical gravitational relationship, and it has to come up with a value. On the right side is a magnetical gravitational relationship, and it has to come up with a value. And so these two values have to balance. But then we see that there are different energy states, such as atomic state, nanostate, and GaN state. And then we find that we can transcend these various states and still maintain a balance. Well, how do we do this? And so the word mass comes into play. And so we're going to have a little bit of fun with mathematics and try and keep it as simple as possible so that we can understand how is it possible that when we make the cups of life and we put in some metals and some water and some salt, and we have created from an atomic structure a monatomic structure. And then that structure has two different characteristics. One is a physical strength and one is an emotional strength. And just for instance, and then when we put the two together, they represent the cup of man because we are physical and we are emotional. So the physicality is what we relate to in the matter state, but the discussions that we have are using words. And in the matter state of a plasmatic condition, words are not understood. The communication is done through the emotion. So in the matter state, the two primary things that we need to concern ourselves with is the emotional and the physical aspects of our matter state. And so we find that this pertains to all the elements. And then when we find that we need to get into beyond the nanocoding and into the GANS process, we find that we get into compounds, molecules, such as CO2 GANs and calcium carbonate GANs and ZNO GANs, CuO GANs, H2O GANs, and amino acid GANs, which is carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And then we can actually extend beyond that. So we have gold, for instance, we have a range of very exotic nuclear products. And then we have many, many earth ganses. And the thing about these earth ganses is that they're from Earth. Not to say that they can't be on another planet, but this group of ganses is specific to Earth. And in that way, it makes us kind of unique. And the only reason that this is important for us and for it to be unique for us is because it involves us. So we have gravitated to Earth because of these ganses. And so this is fundamentally friendly to us. And as such, if we can find another environment that is fundamentally friendly to us, then we can go there. And in order to, shall we say, make a choice, this choice is based on the mass, because we will find that the mass on Earth or the mass on some other planet would be the same with respect to these fundamental ganses. So when we're talking about the matter plasma, there is a limitation to this matter plasma. Fundamentally, there's the physical plasma, which you can touch and see. That's our physicality. But then there's the plasmatic plasma. You can't touch it and you can't see it, but you can see the effect of it. And of course, you can communicate with it through your emotion. But that is the limitation of the matter plasma dimension. And this is why we are feedback dominant, because we restrict ourselves to just understanding things that we can get like really near to and not fully explore. So we can see the Gans and we understand that the Gans has a field around it. And that's as far as we go. But we need to go one step beyond. We need to understand that these relationships have to do with what we call a Magrav balancing, which is a balance of the magnetical and gravitational field forces. And balance is the key word. But balance doesn't mean equal. Balance means imbalance of strength and give and take. And so if we look at equal and we look at only one component of equal, then I guess everything would be super simple. But when we look at our Earth, we see that it's not super simple. It's very complex. And we see that with this complexity comes stability. And so that's a good thing. So the equalness comes with many factors coming together in a form of balance. So when we see the scientific community talk about balance, the conservation of magnetic fields versus the conservation of energy, there is one balance. But then we look at the spiritual community trying to balance out the spirit and the soul, there is one balance. Now, if we take the scientific community and the spiritual community and take into consideration and balance those fields, and then to make things, yes, more complex, but also more stable, if we add the plasma science and its balance and add that to the knowledge, now you have a thriving relationship. And so that is the difference between the plasma science and all the other sciences. And that is the difference of the direction that we're going. So, how do we teach that? And how do we explain that? And how long is it going to take when it's almost taken us forever? And when I say forever, thousands of years to come to this point. And is this the only time that we've come to this point? So we are at a flex point of susceptibility. And so when we look at the conservation of susceptibility, we have to understand that there are variables. And so these variables are all independent plasmatic variables. And as such, each of them have their own magnetical and gravitational mass relationship. And of course, in order to balance into a magrav, the mass relationship on the one side, which we call the magnetical susceptibility, and the mass relationship on the other side, which we call the gravitational susceptibility, have to come into balance. So remembering that something is always something as opposed to something else. And so what is the determination? Well, it's this independent plasmatic variable. And of course, this comes from the principal matter because the principal matter comes from everywhere. It is a convergence of the principal matter, the transition matter, and the convergence matter. And it goes through a conversion into the plasmagen matter. And that stays in the plasmagen matter until it interacts with another magrav, which we call the environment. And so now when we take that and interact with that, so the plasmagen interacting with the environment creates a field interaction we call inertia, then we have the choice of manifesting in the physicality. And at that point, there are further criteria to take into account. So fundamentally, when we're looking at the principal matter interaction, we see that the energy that is coming in a pack, and of course we want to parcel it up really nicely, we find that the energy packs come in different flavors. And the reason for that, of course, is they come from all different directions. They've all traveled a different journey, and they come together through a common denominator to converge in this polar interaction. And so it gives it an attribute, a characteristic, and a unique quality. And so that becomes a welcome. And we all share that because we're all here. But we're here, you see, because the energy is a two-way street. So it involves a two-way transmission and a two-way transition. And we look at this whole planet and we say, okay, well, it's a blue planet because it's the water planet. But, you know, there are mountains, there are valleys, there's land, there's water. So there's a whole lot of everything here. And the thing about it is that this blue planet emits what it is. And we have gravitated to this blue planet and we emit what we are. And what we emit is actually an emotion. And the blue planet has emitted an emotion. And so what we are is a manifestation of the combination of those emotions. And so these are the fundamental rules in principle energy flow. So energy has to flow. And it not only flows within the earth, but it also has to flow within the nearest and proximity of other objects in the universe. The most important of us for our immediate attention is the sun. So it too has a two-way emission of intention. And as such, then the sun and the earth create this covalent bonding connection, and it makes the earth that much more welcome for us. So when we look at the conservation of susceptibility, we see that, you know, the x-axis indicates a relationship, but the y-axis indicates a transmutation. So we have things moving around us, we have things moving within us, and then, of course, we collectively and individually can do the movement ourselves. So that gives us a lot of choices and a lot of flexibilities, and this is all part of the matter state. But when we look at the matter state and the interaction of the various points, in many cases, you know, we say, well, that's an affirmation of life. But if we limit ourselves to this kind of cyclic description of our life, it could also be a denial of life because we're not seeing the rest of the picture. What we are assuming is that these points are bonded together. But, you know, each point has a tensity of containment, and each point has a mass relationship. And so we still haven't figured out how to make the choice. We just have to understand that a choice has to be made. Because when we're looking at a spherical field, we find that the plasma fields are overlapping, right? So we have a Gans manifestation, many different Ganses, many different physicalities, and each one is a maggrav. And each of these fields are in a covalent bonding, which is to say, each one contains both a magnetical and a gravitational relationship, and as such, it needs to be bound together. But that's one field. Then when we look at interacting spheres, we see from a polar point of view that one sphere can be connected from the North Pole but goes to the South Pole of the other sphere. And then in return, the South Pole comes back to the North Pole. And so we have an interaction from a polar point of view. But what we have to now take into consideration is the mass point of view of the interacting spheres, because not all spheres are the same. And if they're not the same, then they don't have the same mass. So how can they interact and have this affinity to interact? And then how do we exchange this energy? How do we go through this MAGRAV energy transfer state. So that's the discussion that we're having today. So we've been talking about the conservation of plasmagen state dependency, which means it's a matter-gen two-way street of equality. But this equality means energy going back and forth, and the rate at which it goes back and forth is predetermined by conditions. So, as we said, one of those conditions is the magnetical gravitational field forces on each side. A second consideration is the energy state, whether it's atomic, nano, or GaN state. And then there are other factors to take into consideration, such as the tendency and susceptibility to stay within the conservation and containment of the tensity. The tensity keeps the containment contained. So let's just do a little bit of discussion on what it means for atomic mass, and let's use this as a review. So the quantity of matter contained in an atom of an element is the atomic mass. And the observed atomic mass is slightly less, just a little bit, than the sum of the mass of the protons, neutrons, and electrons. Like it's, we'll just fudge the rest, okay? We're good at doing that. And then there's atomic number. And so when we see the atomic mass is the average weighted mass number of all the isotopes of a given element. So this means that an element can have a different mass. Well, that is kind of confusing, isn't it? So we calculate the base on a frequency of different isotopes of that particular element, and then take the average, and we say, okay, well, that's the atomic mass. And then we assign an atomic number, which is representative of the number of protons in an atom's nucleus. And it is the same for all the atoms of a given element. So regardless of the atomic number, regardless of the mass, the atomic number is the same. Okay, so we accept that. But let's look at the mass formula. So the atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons plus the number of electrons. And chemists have agreed that a neutral atom of the isotope carbon-12 is the appropriate standard. Okay, so this is pretty handy because we're organic beings, and that means we're carbon-based. And if we're carbon-based, then carbon is something that should be very, very friendly to us. Okay, but that's another subject. Going to atomic weight. Atomic mass and atomic weight are two ways scientists measure the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And they're not exactly interchangeable terms, are they? So the atomic mass includes only protons and neutrons, while the atomic weight also includes the electron mass in its calculation. Okay, but you see, there's a thing about the electrons, you see, because they're kind of small, it's kind of like the dust on your table. So we look at the average mass, and it's a basic physical property of matter. So the mass of an atom or a molecule is referred to the atomic mass, and it's used to find the average mass of elements and molecules and to solve stoichiometry problems. Well, there's another 10-cent word. So let's check on that one. What is stoichiometry? So in chemistry, the determination of proportions of which elements or compounds react with one another, right? So the rules followed in the determination of stoichiometric relationships are based on, oh, look at this. the laws of conservation of mass and energy, and the law of combining weights or volumes. Oh, isn't that interesting? So, as we said, we are going to measure the atomic mass, which is the average of the individual masses of the atoms that make up an element. The individual masses. We're looking at the average of the mass. I would interpret that to say not all masses are the same. And so the atomic mass measures the sum total mass of all the subatomic particles in an atom. And as we said, electrons are so small, so only the mass of the nucleus of an atom is used for atomic mass. Okay? Let's just forget about the other stuff. It's only just, kind of floating around. So when we're looking at the periodic table of prejudice, and I say it's a prejudice because it's prejudice to Earth space, and so these are the elements, and they are nicely, neatly, numerically, sequentially aligned. And so, here we see some of the most important ones to us. We're familiar with the amino acids, and then, of course, the copper, the zinc, and the gold, and the iron. And then, of course, the sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And then these two other elements, silicon and sulfur, which are really, really dense and reactive. And they kind of important, but let's just simplify things and look at some of the basic numbers. And so we're just taking a little component of the periodic table of prejudice, and we're just going to isolate on our favorites, the amino acids. And we look at the numbers, and they're based on the proton, we say. Okay, so that's how we arrive at carbon 6, nitrogen 7, oxygen 8, and hydrogen 1. And then, of course, if we add the neutron, so we basically double. It's always a one-to-one relationship. So we have 6 carbon becomes 12, 7 nitrogen becomes 14, and 8 oxygen becomes 16. Now, the hydrogen, unfortunately, does not have a neutron. No, no, no. No neutron hydrogen. Okay, so when we're looking at the mass, remember, we are looking at the protons and the neutrons. And so there's a number below, and that is the atomic mass. So how do we figure the number of neutrons when we have the atomic number? And so in basic mathematics, we take the atomic mass and subtract the atomic number. And what you're left with, in this particular example of carbon, 6.01. Well, let's just fudge the one, okay? Like, who cares? We're just going to focus on the 6 neutrons, okay? Close enough. Close enough. So, but a funny thing happens. When we look at the mass, and we see that the mass isn't as neat as we make it out. And when we look at the basic amino acids, well, 12.01, pretty close. 14.01, yeah, pretty close. 16.00, oh, this is good. This is bang on. But wait, that hydrogen, it's got a 0.008 extra. Where did that mass come from? Strange. So we see that the atomic mass takes into consideration the electrons. So that would be the discrepancy. Okay. So let's see what the relationship is on the average atomic mass. So let's do some basic mathematics. We're going to take the mass and divide it by the average atomic mass. And what number do we get? It really should be the average of the electron, shouldn't it? Because that's what's the fudge that's left over. And so we find in the carbon we have 0.0008 left over, but in the nitrogen we have 0.0007 left over. We don't have any left over in the oxygen, but when we get to the hydrogen, well, it's only 0.008, an order of magnitude less left over, or I'm sorry, 0.008 would be an order of magnitude more left over. And if we're not taking into account the electron, well, it's supposed to be only the proton left, but we have more left over. Something's not working here. Let's take a look at silicon. Maybe we get a better example because it's a more complex, and maybe we have a different number. And oh my God, the average atomic mass is 1.003, another totally different number. So we cannot seem to get the same mass relationship in all of the elements. So we're kind of fudging things, aren't we? So we have to understand, who we are. And so maybe having a PhD has more to do with piling it higher and deeper because our observations are kind of murky. So we can no longer assume that a neutron is actually the same. And as we discovered last week, when a neutron density is within the surface, that becomes the tension containment limit. And once we pass that limit, then it can radiate. So the embodiment of the radiance can escape from the containment. And which radiance is going to escape? Because there are different flavors. So each of those flavors has a different mass. So therefore, there is a factor that comes into play. And that flavor is based on a feedback. That feedback causes the flavor change. So at this point in time, without the feedback, but we don't know what the radiance is going to be. We don't know what we have to keep within that containment. So once we get that feedback, then we know what we can radiate, and how we radiate is through the neutron release. So when the neutron density exceeds the surface tension containment, then it bursts. So we release the PM tick. And the PM tick, of course, is a maggrav, has a magnetico-gravitational balance. And so the neutron now has burst and has become an electron proton. However, the mass of the electron-proton combination does not equal the mass of the neutron. So that's why we average things out, right? To kind of fudge things over. So if we were to add the release of the PM ticks as an energy, as a mass, then maybe it would be in balance. Maybe. But we've already determined that the neutron is not fixed in its mass. So the thing we have to understand is that there are different energy states. And so when we were looking at the pH of a particular energy state, what we couldn't see was the other energy states. And what we did determine was that when you split up the energy of water into acid and alkaline, there is a corresponding relationship. But what happens when we transcend these energy states? So in simple mathematics, we can add and subtract. Pretty simple. So far, we've done calculations on the atomic mass very simply, adding protons and neutrons. And of course, to make it really simple, well, we get rid of the electrons. But anyway, if we transcend the various states, and if we understand that, well, we've already talked about the atomic state and nanostate and the gas state, and we know that we can do that because we've all done it in our homes. So they're on the physical state, but they have a field strength, which we call a plasma state. And so these four states basically comprise what we refer to as the matter state. But these field transactions are not restricted solely to these states. Because when we say plasma state, we haven't decided how many plasma states are going to be there. We've only decided on the basic three, the atomic, nano, and the GANs. Okay, so we like to refer to carbon-12 as our base state. And we said that that's part of the transmission state. And then carbon-10 and carbon-14 are isotopes, you see, so they're not in the physicality. They're not very stable, but they do exist. And so we find that they can stay as carbon even though the mass has changed. And this is what we say about the mass. We can add these isotopes together and come up with an average mass. And so the average mass has been carbon-12, 6 protons and 6 neutrons. And I guess that's good, because if I take 10 and 14, that's 24, and that's of 2 components. Divide those 2 into 1, and that's 12. Well, that works. Well, let's try if we go to the transmutation state, and we see carbon-16 and carbon-8. So let's do our mathematics there. 8 and 16 is 24, and there's 2 carbons. Divide that by 2, and it comes up to carbon-12. Oh, okay. Well, that works. So we see how the left side is in balance with the right side, except that the left side and the right side are not so much in balance in that energy state as they are with the mass. So in other words, regardless of which energy state we're referencing, the physical component of that energy state remains at carbon-12. Maybe I need to rephrase that. In the physical state, carbon-12 is the physical carbon. In the transition state, carbon-12 is the physical component of the carbon isotope state. We can say then the same thing in the highest energy state. The carbon-12 is a physical component of all the isotopes in that state. So it is possible to carry the physical component embedded within the energy state. It's mathematically possible. Well, what about the in-between states? Because one thing that's unique about this is that all of these carbon isotopes are even, or they're symmetric, which is handy, isn't it? Because it's always divisible by 2. Well, let's just look at the in-between states. They are odd. For instance, we have a C9 and a C15. And here's what's interesting. 9 and 15 are 24, and the 2 components divided by 2 is carbon 12. So even in the asymmetric function, the physical representation is still possible. And if we go down one level, which is more dense, right? The 11 and 13 is 24, and divide that by 2, we get the carbon 12. So that's on the elemental side. But when we get into the molecular side, which is the combination of elements, so in this case, if we take the combination of carbon and hydrogen, if the carbon is 12 and the hydrogen is 1, and we have 3 of them, that comes out to carbon 15. And so the balance between one energy state, which is asymmetric at carbon 15, and the balance with the other energy state, which is a total of 15, that is in balance. The mass is the same. And the physical component of the carbon is embedded within. So that's just one example. And so we see the whole relationship, the symmetric and the asymmetric levels of how we can go through the different isotopes. So we see that the symmetric and asymmetric levels alternate because they allow us to exchange energy from one level to another level. And there's no rule that says we only go from one level to the adjoining level. Okay, so for instance, if we have carbon 14, and if we want to maintain a balance with a lower energy state, then we can run into a nitrogen 14. We find that the mass of the carbon 14 and the mass of the nitrogen 14 are the same, but they're clearly not the same. One is carbon and one is nitrogen. And then if we look at the carbon 16, which is in a higher energy state, and then we look at the mass of the oxygen in 16, and those are the same, and those are in balance. But they're not in adjoining energy states. That's the point. The carbon 14 and nitrogen 14 are in the neighboring states, but the oxygen 16 and the carbon 16 are not. They skip. And so they don't have to be adjoining, but there has to be a nearness and proximity. And so when we look at these compound molecules and how they operate, so we can see that the C14 and the nitrogen 14 are the same. And then we see the C16 and the oxygen 16 are the same. And all of these mentioned are symmetric. And then we find the CH3 is in between. And it is uneven. It's asymmetric. And it is a molecule. And so now we see the relationship of the carbon 15 to the CH3. And if we take this one step further, then we can ask, well, on the basis of the basic pH table, we can see that the atomic mass, as it changes the element. And so there has to be a balance. And so what's interesting is that the beryllium 8 and the oxygen 16 combination is 24, and those two elements divided by 2 is carbon 12. And then for boron 10 and nitrogen 14, and the combination is 24, and the division of those two is carbon 12. So we can then say that the carbon 12 in its physicality is embedded within the physical state. And we've already determined that if we look at the transition state, the carbon 10 and the carbon 14, the total of those is 24, divided by 2 is carbon 12. We see that the carbon 12 is embedded in that state as well. Okay, so then we understand that the balancing of this equation, the balancing of the magnetical gravitational fields and the balancing of the so-called energy states doesn't have to be on the same energy state. And it doesn't have to be on the neighboring side. But if we have the 1/10 on the one side and the other 10th on the other side, maybe that's not quite correct. Maybe it would be better to put the two on the same side, because to balance off, say, the carbon 15 with the CH3, which is an atomic mass of 15 also, then they would have to be balanced, but they would be on the same side of the equation. And then if we look at carbon 14 and its connection to the rest of the universe, then we find that carbon 15 is actually carbon 14 plus 1, or carbon plus 2, or nitrogen 14, or maybe we start adding and going the other way, and we see that if we start adding more than 2, and we take the carbon 15 and add the carbon 15, they come together as carbon 30, and then we add all 3 of those together and they come as carbon 60, and we find that they have higher energies. And so in simple mathematics, what we're saying is that it's additive and it's subtractive. And so if we want to navigate from energy state to energy state, we have to be able to add and subtract the mass. And that is how, in simple terms, we can go from a magrav atomic state to a monatomic nanostate to a polyatomic GaN state to the field of the plasma state. And then we understand that we can even go one step beyond. But if we look at the bottom and we look at that barrier and we say, well, there's a Coulomb barrier on this Earth. Yes, it is, because that becomes our point of containment. All of these elements are on this planet. And so we see that if we understand how to do basic mathematics, then we can create gold. And as we've always said with the amino acids, it always comes out of the thin air. But in reality, because the amino acids are protein, it comes out of the fat air. And so the law of conservation is really taking into account pathing and susceptibility. And as we said, there's a magnetical and there's a gravitational emission. And so one is of attention and one is of retention. And these always interact with the creation emission of intention. So they don't have to be next to each other. All we have to do is consider the nearness and proximity. And we find that the covalent bonding of fields contained within their tensity and their mass, right? Because the field is different based on the mass. And so the point of conflict needs to be converted to become a conflict resolution, a point of containment, a point of bonding. And as such, then the energy can flow. But we seek energy binding in a self-serving manner, and that's okay. But when we do it at the expense of others who are also seeking energy binding in a self-serving manner, we are violating the laws of conservation because we are now stealing from the same energy state that our neighbor is depending on and ignoring the rest. So when we look at the laws of conservation, we find that there is the rest. And this is the whole point. When we're looking at the plasma rule and we say the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, where is this higher strength? Okay. And so to have this higher strength, it has to develop a binding zone and it has to keep a tensity to keep that binding zone. And then within that binding zone, it has a mass, right? And so that mass is the energy manifestation. And so when we're looking at the transmutation dimensions, we find that the mass affects our position between the magnetical and gravitational fields forces. And so we have a range transition there in terms of energy state. And then we also have a transmission of elemental susceptibility based on the pH of tensity. So the transmutation is actually range transition, which transcends the y-axis transmutation dimension. And the laws of conservation govern the covalent bonding attributes. And we just don't take enough into account. So we see that tensity is a variable, and also mass is a variable. So the containment requires gravitational tensity and mass. And so when we look at the weight and we find that it anchors us to this planet, and what we're trying to understand is how we transition from the bond age of chains to the covalent bonding of atomic mass. We are in the post-15th of March 2024 era of choices. We're making a new selection process, understanding the bountiful space of Earth space and how we can get into that outer space, transmutation space. We already have the gravitational confirmation of our Earth space. This hydrogen is giving us its fingerprint and is the basic atomic structure with the basic mass. And from that mass, we build all the other mass in the atomic elements, the periodic table of prejudice. And so the energy states change. And so the cornerstones of science incorporate the nano, the pico, the GANS, the plasma, and the soul. These are all the channels for the emission of intention. And that is transmitted on the transmission spectrum, which transitions susceptibility. And this is based on the surface superficiality of the physicality versus the internal substance of the plasmatic reality. And so we look at this point of containment as being the plasmatic interaction. And the only thing that we seem to be focused on is this beautiful color spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum in this point of containment between the gravitational and magnetical field forces, completely ignoring the other elements that are one step beyond. And then understand there's another step beyond that step. So the plasma balance comes together for us the same way. When the knowledge and the wisdom, it gives us a deeper insight. And this experience can change a man's perspective because it now allows us to reflect on life, to see the giving and taking of energy, and see that the misconduct becomes harder to rationalize. And any reference in the historical context really becomes meaningless because what happened 1,000 years ago has no bearing on today. There is no extrapolation in that regard. Once you know, you need to change. And so the pH balancing is always seeking a polar balance, and it's uncut in any state. So the state dependency and transcendence is also uncut. So our emotion of intention is interdependent and manifests in both plasma state and matter state. And so when we're looking at the pH of the magrav, we have to understand that there are many points on the perspective scale, not just this scale that you're looking at right now, but there are other scales that are behind. And this is what the blue planet is made from. It isn't just what you see is what you get. There's more. There's a whole world behind our world that has created our world. And it comes from this potentiation layers of the many points of the field strength of the dove, which is the true representation of the pH of peace. Peace, not just on this planet, but peace in the universe. And if we want to transcend and transmute between the two, those are the rules of the game. And so we continue with the transmutation testing in the next 3 months with the nutrition and wellness testing starting in November. Please join us. And also, as a plasma scientist, understand it's time to not scrap the old, but it's time to move to the new and add to it. Add to what you know and incorporate what is new so we can bring peace and prosperity to this planet to achieve the greater oneness that transcends the limitations of the nuclear science, which has been holding us back. And for 561 weeks through the Knowledge Seekers workshops, we've been publicly letting people know it's been always there, more than 10 years. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers, learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. We need to sign it. Adults need to come into the building and sign it and to teach the children to sign it, teach the hooligans to sign it, to understand what it means to stand up for humanity, because man is a reactor of a three-dimensional transcendent universe. And can man manifest the tensity of heaven through field transmutation? You bet you. Can man go into outer space without a peace dome? Doubtful. Can we transmute through the dimensions of history? We already have. It is embedded within us. That's why the many combinations exist of the X and Y axis sphere creation. So this simple layman's mathematics hopefully helps to explain the physical transmission dimensions. Understand that they're there, even if you don't understand how this works. And understand that the plasma science needs to be delivered daily via the peace dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So, welcome to the new outer space age, and thanks for allowing me to present.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Wow, that was quite a different teaching. I don't know if I came up with any great questions for you, but let's see if the participants may want to ask a question or have a go at you in so many ways. Perhaps taking exception to what you said or confirming in a way what you said. Not that you need the confirmation in the matter state. This is how you're understanding it. And again, it's all what befits us as individuals. So let's see if anyone in the participants list has a question. Is it appropriate to call a dog a magrev rather than a dog, or the sun a magrev rather than the sun? Is this bringing in some sort of confusion, Alex, or is it better stated in these scientific terms to understand it's just not a sun? There's a lot more dynamism going on.
That's a really good question because
It is?
it's about time. It's about time you asked the
About time, I know.
question. So, I think we all agree that we have a notion as what's the difference between a stone and a dog. And I guess I was as shocked as anybody to find out that a stone has a soul. And what kind of soul does a stone have? You know, it can't really be a very strong soul, but it has a soul because of the fact that it has manifest in physicality. So that becomes part of the, shall we say, the rules of the game. And if we accept that as the rules of the game, then when we say our physicality, which is, you know, we're far more versatile than a stone, far more capable than a stone, and in most cases more interesting. I could think of some cases where it's not, but anyway, the question then becomes if we are a magrav, and if we have a soul, and if the stone is a magrav and it has a soul, then that doesn't account for the difference. Something else accounts for the difference. And this is what we have to respect. And this is the first problem. We don't have the respect. And so we need to respect the humanity. And then we need to understand that this rule that has allowed us to become physical was actually an extension of a rule that is played out in the plasma state. So science has been kind of straddling this whole business by saying, well, the most stable thing is carbon-12. And yet we have these other isotopes, and then we have to take those into account and average them out. And then based on those, you know, kind of fudged numbers, come up with an exact science. Well, fudged numbers do not make an exact science. An exact science makes an exact science. Okay, so this is the thing that we have to understand that words have a meaning. So close only counts in horseshoes, and we are trying to create a precision. And this becomes very, very important. I said, well, I don't have the skills to be precise. And yet, when you go to sleep and you start to dream and you, shall we say, gallivant across the universe, And then you want to come back in the morning. You better be precise. You better come into your body. Precision is mandatory. It's not a option. I think I'm going to come into another body. Well, then we find that that is a possibility, except that other body would have to be your body. So there's a protocol and there's a ethics that you have to follow. And you say, well, why am I not following that in the physical state? Why do we have this exception? So we have this exception because we have this delay in consequences. And this is a feature. Isn't it nice? Maybe I can borrow $10 for you and pay you next week because it helps me out today. Isn't that nice? And then when next week comes and say, oh, Mark, sorry, I really wasn't, sincere. Well, then, there are consequences of that as well. And this is how we conduct ourselves. We don't think it's important enough. We don't think it's important enough to be precise. And, I'm not talking about military precision. I'm talking about being precise in the way we conduct ourselves. So we have to have a respect for each other. And we have to understand the difference that we have achieved and look at it as a feature and not as a superiority, but as an advantage, if you will, an enhancement, if you will. And if we have this enhancement, then it stands to reason that there are those who don't. And if we have this enhancement, it stands to reason that others who have an enhancement of some sort could be one that we don't. Do we have all of the enhancements? Or is this just one of the enhancements that we have? And I think it's a very significant enhancement because when you look at the organization of the universe, it is well organized. And if it was dependent on us and our energy binding needs, we'd be in a whole lot of trouble. Planets would be kind of rotating all over the place. And there was an American sport called roller derby, and everybody would be jamming. And, just going around and bumping into each other, and then things could get kind of hairy. For roller derby, it's entertainment, but in the world of life, our misery is not entertainment. It's not something to laugh about. And this is what we've devolved into. And it's really sad. We need to understand that there's a common thread with all of us. And that common thread is manifest through our emotion. Our emotion carries the message. So we have to create a dimension, a pattern, and then from that pattern, we get the energy. That's what we really have to understand, is how to facilitate these physical transmission dimensions to our advantage, and not advantage as opposed to someone else's disadvantage. But our strength lies on our neighbor's strength. In other words, our strength isn't how much we dominate our neighbor. Our strength is dependent on how strong our neighbors are. This is a changing point of view to understand that we are part of a field and we are contributors to that field. But we are part of that field and that field contributes to us. And so this should be a welcome point of view. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Alex. Anyone else have a thought or an idea or something they'd like to share with us? You talk about complexity brings more balance, but Mr. Kesh is saying his systems have become more simpler. Does that mean they're less balanced? I was just thinking, he said the newer systems are so simple. I mean, we don't understand it, but they're not as elaborate, I guess, as the original reactors. So you're saying that complexity creates balance, but he's saying these systems are simpler. So does that mean, again, there's not a balance? I wouldn't think so, but how do you sort of equate those?
The fundamental thing for the average physicist is that there are four uh, fields, four energy states. There are the strong and weak nuclear fields, the gravitational field, and the electromagnetic. And we don't even call them fields; we call them field forces. So the problem with this whole thing is that the strong nuclear forces are actually weak because they are between the planets, right? So the planets are huge, so the forces need to be huge, but they're actually very weak because of the distance. The nuclear forces, of course, are very strong uh, because of the nearness, but in actuality, they're weak because you only have to put the electron and the proton together. Well, by looking at the MAGRAV, we now can see that the strong nuclear forces and the weak nuclear forces are actually nuclear forces. And so the nuclear forces are a balance between the magnetical and gravitational forces. Well, wait a second. The gravitational force is one of those forces, the gravity. And the magnetical forces are one of those other forces, the electromagnetic forces. So then if we find that the balance of the nuclear forces are the magnetical and gravitational forces, then we find that the balance between the electromagnetic and the gravitational forces are just another description of the strong and weak nuclear forces. They're the same thing. So we can take those four field forces and bring them down into two field forces. So by your definition, that would be simpler. But it doesn't make it any less stable because they have been stable all along. Whether you look at the old paradigm or the new paradigm, they are still in balance and they are still stable. And so it's the same thing that I say with the DNA. The DNA is the same in all the cells, but the cells are different. So how can the DNA be the same and the cells be different? Which means that the criteria for the difference is not the DNA itself. So the criteria for the variability, the spice of life on this planet, is not in the magnetical gravitational field forces, but in the range of the gravitational magnetical field forces. So by adjusting nearness and proximity, by adjusting the path link of susceptibility, and retaining the magnetical gravitational field force, and understanding that energy is always in motion, so then the key factor is that in order to keep this energy, we have to put it in a containment field. understanding that this containment field is simultaneously interacting with other containment fields. So in the process of interacting, there's neither an addition nor a subtraction, but it becomes more of a catalytic reaction. So there's a giving and taking and giving and taking, and it's done in rapid succession so that the containment is maintained. Now, that containment would carry a mass. If we indeed want to change that mass, here's a couple of things that can happen. One, we know that different elements have a different mass on the periodic table. So if we were to reduce the mass of a particular containment, we would actually change the element. Likewise, if we were to increase the mass, we would change the element. But if we were to completely burst the tensity of that containment, there would be no mass. That mass of that element will now have completely dissolved and become part of another containment. And the choice of that containment is based on a susceptibility and our skill set in determining that susceptibility. And that's what it means to be a plasma scientist. So a plasma scientist can add and subtract the mass and maintain the balance, and do this in very simple terms by observing the laws of magnetical gravitational field forces. Back to you, Mark.
Exciting when I understand it completely. Or maybe if we were in the church, they'd be saying a mass for that mass who they thought was departed. Anyone else in the participants list who'd like to share something? I see
Yes.
Nikolai. Hello.
Hello,
Welcome.
everybody. Thank
Hello.
you. You said something interesting, Alex, which sometimes you go through this whole rigmarole and I get little peaks of an idea and then I lose them again. And so I want to jump on this one a little bit before I forget it. But the isotopes are where this magic happens. So if there is a way to play with the fields of a specific element, it's within the isotope range to change that field, is it not? Because that's where the wiggle room can happen. So we can add and subtract back and forth in that space to shift the energy states within the confined zone until it becomes greater than or less than the target of the initial element.
So that's 100% correct what you just said. So there's no point me adding to that.
It just struck me for the first time. I hadn't really thought about this before, Alex. So that's what came through in my little click.
Yeah, but that's very clear-headed. Okay, that's clear thinking. Okay, now when we look at our energy states within our nearness and proximity, what is interesting about this particular diagram here, or maybe I should go to another one here, is to understand that these different energy states are being played out. Okay, we're talking about atomic, nanogans, and plasma state. They are being played out on Earth. Like we don't have to leave Earth to experience a plasma state. Okay, we don't have to go into outer space to experience a plasma state. This becomes an important thing for us to understand, because now we see that if we've only been working with the atomic state, if we were just to apply basic mathematics on this particular diagram, we're only concerned with 25% of reality. Okay, so if you're only working 25% of reality, I'd say, you need to get your money back. You're not getting your money's worth. Okay, but now if we were to look at this and say, okay, all of these energy states are on Earth. And if carbon-14 is a connector, and the reason it's an effective connector is because it's in a plasmatic state as an isotope, meaning that it can come down into carbon-12, or it can come down into, nitrogen-14, right? And what's it connected to? What it's connected to is not on this chart. That's the point. Now we are connected to other dimensions that are beyond this chart. And once we realize that, then questions like, oh, where did I come from? Well, and where are you going? And who am I? And all of this, then we can start answering those questions. But until we understand that we are part of a greater reality and that we have a connection to it, and now that it's been pointed out to us that here is that connection, and what makes this connection entirely possible is because of the versatility of the plasmatic state. The physical state does not have that. The physical state is, in fact, an inertia field, which is the sum total of the interaction of other fields. And when we say 1 and 1 is more than 2, okay, so we take 2 into account and we create an inertia field, and the answer is more than 2. But what happens if we take into account 5 different fields, like a star formation, 4 points on the star and the center point? And then what happens if we take into account 4 star formations? 5 points, 4 stars. Now we have 20 points. 20 points have more mass than 4 points or 5 points. And so the connection remains. And we can build on that. And so that becomes the difference between that mass of a stone and that mass of a human. And the energy state of a human is multiple combinations of atomic bombs worth. It's that powerful. So we have this higher retention within our field. That's what makes us so unique. And when you look at the Earth and how much it's retaining, you have to understand that its retention is massive. And when you compare that to the sun, well, massive is not a big enough word to describe the retention of the field of the sun. And then if you take into account the solar system, well, the English language just kind of withers away. It is incapable of describing this. So what we are now realizing is that there's a whole universe out there which we are connected to because we understand the basic plasma rules. It's very, very simple. However, our little piece of the pie here on Earth is so tiny compared to the rest of the pie. And we almost feel as if we're doing something wrong, by even looking at that pie. Don't even look at it because you might want it. Well, we should want it because it's part of our pie and not something that we need to lord over. And as my friend once said, as he was walking on the beach and he was finding all these beautiful, beautiful stones, and he was gathering them up, and he said, "Oh, this makes a nice collection and they're so beautiful and I can do so much with it." And as he kept walking, getting more and more stones, the load was getting heavier and heavier. And then he decided, yeah, these will be my stones, and I will just leave them here on the beach, and so I don't have to carry them. And so he placed all the stones on the ground, and he walked with a much lighter load. And this is what we have to realize: the universe is ours, but we don't have to have it. What we have to do is use it in a proper ethical and moral manner, the way it was originally intended. And if we do that, then peace and prosperity is ours. It's as simple as that. I hope that helps, Nikolai. It's great to hear from you.
Thanks, Alex. It's always nice to jump in here. I find this picture of a tent on C14 in the middle to be kind of funny. Only relevant for my own amusement, of course, because I've watched something this morning in a little video, and I may as well share the cliff notes. I've been looking into a lot of blockchain technologies in the research projects that I've been working on, and so one of the tools that has just shown up is something that leverages the idea of intents, and they spell it INTENTS. And the tool is as a tool for the Ethereum blockchain for what they're calling layer 2, which was a very scattered blockchain. And so the point of these intents is to collapse the space between these different layers to have them talk to each other. So it's an interoperability intent. And this is the seemingly joke of the joke here for me, because this is the movement that can kind of jump all over the place and make connections from any one of these dimensions to the lower ones and the higher ones as it decides to. And you've placed the intent in the right place.
Did you hear my class last week?
I did not know.
It talks about intensity.
Oh, well, intents are coming out. Yeah, no, this was a video I watched just earlier today.
Yeah, mine's better.
Yeah. This is a 1 minute one. Don't worry, yours is certainly got more in it than I learned from that. But no, I think it's quite interesting just in general, having my interest peaked in different places at the same time, and this looks like a blockchain in a way, as I'm looking at these different chunks of information moving from one place to another and having to make sure that they can collaborate and share energies. So it's very similar in many ways.
So I think the key point here is that we don't have to go off planet to understand this technology and to understand its versatility. It's not something that you need to get into a rocket and blow yourself up into in between space.
Well, I wanted to share something else. Maybe you have an insight, or maybe this takes the conversation in an interesting turn. Just a couple days ago, I was, I guess this would have been a few days after the most recent sessions here on the transmutation sessions. And I was laying on the beach with one ear kind of to the ground, and all of a sudden in a moment, I could kind of hear the voices fading in the background. People talking, chatter, bird sounds, whatever, just starting to disappear. And for an instant, I felt myself going into another one of these states. And I don't know if I think Mark was mentioning something about whether or not that was a specific field that I could feel, if it was a carbon something, and the answer for me was no. There was no thinking in that moment. But the moment that I began to think again, or tried to recreate what had just occurred, of course it stops. And
Right.
so this was this moment of deep letting go without any planning whatsoever, and happening in an instant, and going, oh wow, hang on a second, I'm not comfortable with that. Of course I am comfortable with it, but the ego is not. And it wants to come back. And it came back very perfectly, exactly right where it was. So I'm curious, what do you think in terms of these energy dimensions? What was going on?
Well, it's the same thing that happens when you go to sleep. You park your body, and soul says, "Okay, I am now free to gallivant across the universe and do what I need to do, and I'll come back and pick you up in the morning." And so in your state, I guess we call it a daydream. It is no different. The key point that you made was that you went on this journey without planning, which is a false statement. You did plan on going. You have to remember that you and your soul are one and the same. The physicality is a manifestation of you and your soul on this planet, and that is an inertia field. So the only planning that we seem to recognize is the planning that we acknowledge in the physicality. And even with this picture that you're looking at, if we say, well, the first level is our physicality and the other levels are in the plasma state, which are more relevant to our soul state, we're finding that, oh, wait a second, we're only experiencing 20% of our existence here. The other existence is where you went. And then you're telling me that this first level is doing all the planning? No, I don't think so. You know, I think that the carbon 12 doesn't have enough of a skill set to do enough planning, you know. So I think the
Yeah,
soul.
yeah, that's a good reminder.
So
Yeah.
this is an important point, and this is where when you said that that the trip ended the moment you decided, and again you being in the physicality, I think you really have to differentiate when you say you have to ask yourself, well, you who, and you who soul, not you who physicality. And a lot of people, like to get dreamy and creamy about that, like California dreaming and stuff like that. And, it becomes so ooey gooey syrupy, covered with, you know, 6 scoops of sugar in your coffee. And that's not what it is. What it is, the creamy, dreamy, beautiful reality is the universe. And, the enjoyment of the sharing with the universe is a wonderment that I don't have English words to explain it. I know that I didn't have any of the problems that I'm having today. I didn't have these problems before I was born. And I don't remember anything before I was born. But that's to say, I don't remember anything in the physicality. Now we're finding a totally different reality. We are finding that our historical journey is embedded in our RNA. So the manifestation of our physicality and the emotion that is attached to that physicality is transgenerational. So the memory remains, which means if the memory remains from us prior to our birth, then the memory must retain after our death. And so therefore, we have to choose very carefully what we wish to remember. And one of the things that I have personally been going through in terms of, because I have been doing the transmutation testing sessions for quite a while, is that I have had a chance to review my life, and I can't believe the number of mistakes and the amount of hurt that I have created. And so I can't change that, but I can certainly change my viewpoint with respect to that. And that is to say that I can't carry the baggage if I expect to move forward. And so we tend to be harsh on ourselves. And the reason we need to be harsh on ourselves is because we know the truth. So if we mean to learn from our experience, then those harsh realities have to be learned and have to be remembered and then not repeated. And in fact, correct it. That would be the better phraseology. Correct what you made a mistake from and move on from there. And that's how we learn, and that's how we build. And then that becomes your new RNA. And so we don't have to carry the baggage anymore. At that moment, the baggage just drops. And this is very important for us because there's a lot of people who carry a transgenerational hatred, saying, oh, 500 years ago, my great grandfather fought for this side, and there was a massacre and all this, and so I'm seeking revenge. And so it's, well, at what point does your revenge begin? Are you sure that the what you consider as the revenge point is as a result of what someone else did to you? But is it possible that what someone else did to you was actually a revenge, came from a point of what someone you or in your ancestry did prior to that? Like, you can't just arbitrarily pick your revenge point and discount the rest. That's denying your history and your responsibility in the history. Okay, well, so what happened 100 years ago, we're just going to whitewash the whole thing. And okay, well, that's fine. And if the two sides agree, so okay, I will not carry forward my history and my resentment, and I will bring peace forward. And the potential conflict that you would have with someone else, and they come to the same conflict resolution, well, that would be fine. And so now you have a new set of operating procedures, and you can take advantage of that. But it has to be sincere. And it can only be sincere on a plasmatic level. And so if you are fully dependent on your planning on a physical state, and if you're only dependent on your interpretation of events on a physical state, and if you only listen to the words, and you don't listen to the intent, you don't listen to the soul, and you don't communicate on a elevated emotional level, then you could easily become a victim of another ruse, another deception. And so you need to immunize yourself from this and understand the plasma rule and understand the ethos of the universe. And when I say understand it, understand it meaningfully, because that is the only way that you can punch the ticket to join the universal community, because that's how they communicate. So, you want to play poker in outer space? Have fun, okay? You'll be the only one at the table, because everyone else will just leave you to sit in your own misery. Then life becomes a very, very lonely place. I hope that helps, Nikolai.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a question come up partway through your your words there. It struck a note, and my question is related perhaps to another part of the discussion earlier, where you mentioned DNA and RNA, or at least one of the two, that if I remember correctly, that not everything is based on the DNA. So in these moments, do you think there are other things happening in the RNA field? Is that perhaps what the soul has access to? I mean,
Yes.
big
So,
question, but yeah.
well, you understand the difference, right? Yeah, you understand that the RNA is a precursor for the DNA. So the DNA is a physical manifestation of the blueprint of the RNA.
Hmm.
Okay, so what is the difference between the RNA and the mRNA? The mRNA is a feedback mechanism, and it feeds back to the DNA in the same manner that the RNA feeds to it, but except it comes from the physical side. Okay, so then the mRNA itself is only sending the message, which is the same thing that the RNA is doing, is sending the message. It's the manifestation of the physicality of that message is manifest through the DNA. And the interesting thing about the DNA is that we all have a common denominator, and that is on the maternal side of the genetic code. We all come from the same mother, and that's mind-boggling. That's mind-boggling enough. But the RNA is our path through life. And our path isn't just what we do physically. So there you were daydreaming. So you had an experience. When you go to sleep at night, your soul goes gallivanting. So you have an experience. This experience gets added to your RNA. So yes, the cosmic field forces are interacting with us all the time. And that's why when you look at the uh, neutron, it is constantly changing, because new energies are coming into it. So one of the differences between us and a copper wire, for instance, is that the neutron is very rigid and limited in its capability. So if we were looking at the purity of copper, then the intensity of the containment of the copper neutron would be within a narrow limit. And the more pure it is, the narrower the limit. So, if the copper is contaminated, then the neutron is reflecting on that. And so you see the same with water, and you see, you see its purity, and you see how it reacts in a crystal form with the interaction of emotions. So the emotions are reflecting the purity, and manifest in the um, uh, um, in the containment field of the water. But water has a special affinity, is that it can exchange emotion. And this is the characteristic that's most important because that's the link to the Earth. So now we look at the Earth, and what is it traveling to? It's traveling through space. It has its own cosmic interaction. And so one of the reasons that we have gravitated towards Earth is because of this blending and common denominator between our RNA at the time of arrival and, if you will, the energy field of the Earth as it's translated into emotion. So our emotion reads that. That's why we came here. And our target shooting was very precise. You know, we didn't come to Saturn or to Mercury. We came to Earth. Bullseye. So this is based on historical reference that's gathered up in the RNA. But there's a unique characteristic of our existence on this planet where that memory is manifest as a collective amnesia. And so one wonders then if you remember your first memory, and I would suggest that you were probably several years old when you recall your first memory, then the question has to come to mind, how the hell did you manage? Okay, because you weren't there. How did you go from, babyhood to childhood? How did you do that? You don't remember? You don't remember, crawling on the floor at the age of 4 months and bumping into the, dining room table? You don't remember that? Where were you? And yet we find that babies seem to be able to communicate. What? How is that possible? And what language are they choosing to communicate? And what are they saying? And how do they know? Because you weren't there to remember. So right off the bat, that is your verification and validation that what you do in the physicality is really tiny and insignificant in relationship to everything else. And you have to take that into account, and you have to govern your life that way because you have an opportunity to interpret what life gives you. But life chooses to give you what life thinks you need. Because life knows what you need. So you have to open up and allow life to guide you. But you also have to be a careful navigator, a skillful navigator. And so what life is teaching you is saying, hey, remember that lesson I taught you? You forgot that lesson, and you're bound to make that same mistake. So maybe it's a reminder, or maybe it's a brand new lesson, or maybe it's an add-on to an existing lesson. Either way, life is for learning, and it's like people say to you, oh, I've got a problem, and I'm not feeling very well. I've maybe got a little bit of diabetes or a little bit of cancer, but we want to go on a holiday, and I'll deal with that when I come back. And I say, you know what? Health doesn't take a holiday. Your soul doesn't take care of business according to your holiday schedule. In fact, while you're on holidays, your soul takes care of business also. So this is not something that you can decide when and where. It would be like deciding, oh, my stomach's not feeling so good right now, and then I have a problem with my lung. I think I'm going to take care of my stomach right now, and I'll deal with my lung later. Your soul doesn't operate that way. The soul gives you everything that you need unconditionally, on demand. So you have to open and allow to receive. And this actually is not something that we're taught on a daily basis. So it requires repetition, reinforcement, and then repetition again. And then you test yourself and see, okay, I'm not going to listen to what I'm being told and look at the consequences and then say, well, in hindsight, if I'd have listened to what I was told, then I can see that this would have happened. Okay, well, and that's a mistake, and that's the lesson. So it's not to brood on the mistake, but it's to welcome the lesson. And when you govern yourself that way, then all of a sudden, to use an overused phrase, you become unburdened. Over to you, Nikolai.
Yeah, well, where on the spiral are you? Which way are we looking?
Oh,
One of those, we loop and loop and loop on these things in our lives. I find this happening to me often. Some 3-month cycle or 2-month cycle or a daily cycle or whatever the time in between repeating patterns might be. And I go, oh, wow, this is happening again in my life. Interesting. Well, the last time I reacted this way. This time, oh, I reacted the same, but a little more intense or a little less intense. And then it kind of gives me my navigation as to, is this coming to a head? Which way which way am I going to flop on my face next time? You know, oh, it's a shorter flop. It's a shorter belly flop than last time. Okay, that's better.
That's right. And when you were a teenager, obviously you did a lot of stupid things. Would you agree?
Oh, I think even beyond that for some amount of time, Alex. I don't know if those teenage years are even done at this stage. And
the thing is, when you were a teenager, you depended more on the influence of your friends than you did on the influence of your knowledge. Would you agree?
there was certainly more susceptibility to environment, shall we say.
Right. So now, if you review those events in that context and say, oh, I succumb to the susceptibility of my friends as opposed to the susceptibility of my knowledge, but I didn't have the knowledge at that time. Now I have the knowledge, and now I can apply that knowledge to that particular event. Wouldn't your attitude towards that so-called uh, bad time in your life, or when you did something stupid, wouldn't that just change your outlook and say, okay, now I know how I should have reacted in that situation, and I will be better prepared the next time to depend more on my knowledge and less on my influencers. Would that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think that's a nice way to put it. It's yeah, it's an infinity game in some way. But
Yeah, but you've changed history at that point in time, you see. This is what I'm saying.
okay, yeah. No, I like that. I mean, the other
Well,
thing which comes to mind when you mentioned the child and the memories, the first memories that we have might be at 2, it might be at 4, it might be at 8, depending on what, we decided to forget. And yet that child is so present in his God state that there's nobody home in a way. And yet it's completely dependent on the physicality and has to be a narcissist. It has to demand attention from mom and dad. It has to scream when it runs into the wall because doesn't understand some of these things and is feeling emotion or pain or hunger or whatever for the first time. But yet, I mean, those videos that you can see of one child going up to the other child in the family, the younger one, and asking the younger one, "What's God like? I'm starting to forget." And it makes you go, "Oh my Lord, we've learned all kinds of stuff that we didn't really need to learn." And so, yeah, adding knowledge totally changes how we perceive our past, but also at a certain point, it goes the other way around too. And the ignorance of all the knowledge gets them closer to God, gets them closer to the presence of just being there with nobody home. And look into the eyes of a 1-year-old and you go, oh boy, this is a little bit terrifying, this super present child just gazing at you. I've certainly had those experiences that have made me go, wow, who is home? And yeah, this is an interesting experience, this life. It's both knowledge and it's unlearning at the same time.
So the questions that you're asking are really terrific. But I would like to encourage you to answer the questions for the benefit of others more, because in the process of answering those questions, it forces you to know what you're talking about. Okay, you can't baffle yourself, and you certainly can't baffle someone else. And if you do baffle someone else, then you can't just let them hang. You have to correct. You have to come at it in such a way that they do understand. And I'm not saying come down to their level. I'm saying, bring it from another angle, if you will, to get to the point of the understanding. Find out where the lack of the understanding is, and try and get to that. And if you don't have the time, then you really, really have to work at becoming more efficient. But in the process of developing those skills, you find that you answer your own questions. And the answers to those questions are from, gee, I wonder, if I'm on the right track, to being firm and saying, my answer is repeating the same results regardless of how I come at it. So now I have to become more skillful in coming at it from very different directions, and tune it to the audience so that they can understand, and then help them. And then eventually, they come back to your relationship. Uh, it Sometimes the simplest of explanations become the easiest to do, and only because people don't have the time in today's life. I moved to the country. I moved away from the city, the rat race in the city, because the pace was so phenomenal. And I was shocked at the pace in the country. It's even worse. We don't have traffic. For me to go downtown takes me 5 minutes. And, if you're traveling in a major center, say like Vancouver or Toronto, 5 minutes only gets you to the next stoplight. It's a totally different reality. And then you find, well, why is everybody in a mad rush? Well, because they want to get the regular stuff, that they need for their life. What do you need? You need to go to the bank. You need to go to the grocery store. You need to go to the beer store. You need to get some gas. You may have to pick up some knickknacks, and then you go home. And then you spend the rest of the day drinking, smoking, and talking. And that's the way of life in the country. And then you have the other population, which is a very small part of the population that does all the work, and they work really, really hard. And, you know, everybody's in a rush. Those who have to work, they are run off their feet. And those who like to do nothing like to do a lot of nothing. And so they don't like to do much of anything else. And anything else becomes a waste of time, which includes coming to a knowledge seekers workshop or coming to a meeting like this. So you find that a lot of Americans, for instance, wouldn't come to this meeting because of the football games. I was one of those people. The football was Sunday was very important. But so what? And to do this and talk with you in this intense level, and I'm fully engaged because I have a responsibility when I'm talking to you. I have to make, well, I have to make sense to me. This is the most important thing. I have to be careful that I say things to the best of my knowledge. And I also have to run the risk. And the risk is that I could always stand to be corrected. But not corrected. I'd never have to worry about being corrected as in a reprimand. Okay, because the intention that I'm carrying is automatic. I don't have to think about it. I'm trying to convey a message to you and to the other panelists that is important and is relevant. And I am running into the problem now with other people. And I hearken back to when I first, shall we say, became awake to the reality. And I said, well, you know, I would like to know how to cure cancer. Well, if you want to know how to cure cancer, then you have to know about life. And I'm going to, well, wait a second, you know, can we just, you know, can we just deal with that little thing, cancer, and talk about life later? And no, you know, because the two are uh, completely entangled, that you can't extricate one from the other. So I'm finding, you know, well, what are you doing with the Kesh Foundation? Well, we're bringing peace and prosperity to this planet. Wow, that's a big scheme, you know. Don't you think you should just, you know, set your sights a little bit lower, and, you know, maybe you should do one of those creams, you know, to maybe eliminate a migraine headache, or maybe salute some flags or something, you know? And so, yeah, but that's all part of the peace process. Well, I don't understand. You know, what does that have to do with peace? And if you understand that the common denominator is that the intention comes from the soul, the common denominator, the intention comes from the soul, and the language is the emotion. So if you understand one, you automatically understand the other. Thank you all for allowing me to present today. Quite intense, Nikolai. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure to be with you guys today.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Nikolai, and thanks to each and every one of the participants. Whether you spoke a word or not, you're here and you're supporting on the soul level or the silent line of communication, which is fine too. I don't think we're going to be hearing a lot of talk in the universe. I apologize that the chat was disabled. I don't know why. That's never happened before. Could be due to the new update, but We will check it in the future, make sure the chat is enabled for everyone. Thank you, Claudia. Okay, any other comments from anyone? Or shall we close? I think, again, let me take the screen if I possibly can. We'll continue. And then, of course, we want to wish you all well and thank you again for sharing a part of your life today, these number of hours you were here, but may you be proud of the work you do. And may you be proud of the person you are. And may you be proud of the difference you make. We thank you for your presence. And of course, if we always use the three kings or the three wise men, and again, this is the understanding of Mitraism, to think good, to speak good, and to act good. And of course, if you combine this with the World Peace Treaty, which we showed in the beginning of the program, you have a beautiful shielding around your entity. This is the way I think. I think your emotions will be more in balance. Your physicality will also be more in balance, and you'll be elevating other souls. And when you do that, of course, you become nourished as well. Your soul actually does get nourished. So we want to thank you for that. I'm going to play again, keep the Keshe Foundation free for humanity. We thank the Brazilian team for putting this one together, and Alex for you voicing over in the beginning part of it. But again, go to the store, participate. This is the way we're keeping the Keshe Foundation free for humanity. And there's more to come, much more to come, especially with this ultimate energy system where you will be connected to the energies of the universe directly to yourself through the system. And this is one of the, I think this will complete a lot of the things we've been wondering why we couldn't do more of the same. So I think this new system that'll be employed in the upcoming sessions, and perhaps even this Friday, we'll see more new changes and more transmutations coming out of this. So thank you all again for carrying a very small part of this very large carpet. And of course, thanks to Mr. Keshe, the Keshe Foundation, and all the team members in the background that work with Mr. Keshe that we don't always see, but they're an instrumental part of making this all come together for all of us in so many ways. So thank you all. Have an amazing rest of your day. In Europe, I think it's already flipped over or about to. So we'll play that, and then we will play the final disclaimer, and the meeting will come to an end. So it's our responsibility in so many ways to keep this Keshe Foundation free for humanity. Thank you all. And we'll see you hopefully in one of the next meetings. Anyone else have anything else they'd like to say? Okay, let me just bring up this final one here. I think it's, just let me take that, and maybe it's in back. Yes, here it is. Okay, so we're going to share Keep Keshe Foundation Free for Humanity. And again, we'll see you in one of the upcoming sessions. Thank you all. Have an amazing rest of your day.
Keep Keshe Foundation free for humanity. Become a trial volunteer. And Mr. Keshe is making every effort to keep Keshe Foundation free and independent, and out of control of the multinational corporations. Therefore, we need more knowledge seekers with certain health conditions to come forward and be part of the trials and test. It's different than volunteering for big corporations with huge budgets. For one thing, they pay you to put experimental drugs inside your body because you are taking a risk. With plasma science, it is totally opposite. You are working with plasma fields that cannot damage you, and usually your condition changes or goes away. But you have to pay for it because it's an act of love. to help bring the change to humanity. Please, if you could consider volunteering for these trials. Not only do you benefit, but you bring benefit to others.
This is the tooth of a child, and you can see it literally to the flesh. And this is very few weeks later. Where the tooth is literally recovering and growing. And when you see the changes are so fundamental. And this is what our doctors and dentists are achieving. This is a life of misery, pain, tooth extraction. And this is today, a few weeks later. And you walk away for all the problems. How far this will go? Will it become a complete tooth in the next 6 months, 12 months? And would we see the changes? Because if you're a dentist, and if you're an ordinary man, you can understand the difference between the two. No chemicals, no medicine, nothing was used. The target of our dentists and doctors is to grow tooth where it has gone. It's been pulled out if it's possible. It's been the dream of the dentists. And using the new technology by them, I'm sure they will try. As you can see, the difference between the two is very clear. We see new bones, new structures, new covers appear. It's the same for us with the what we call the world of salinity. Can we create a condition? Would you like to change the screen, please, Greg? Can we come to the point that with application of the remote, we can deliver directly, for example, to build a piece of wall of a heart of a baby, the way we did with a tooth, from thousands of kilometers away, without open heart surgery? Can we rebuild part of a kidney which has been damaged in your dialysis machine? Can our doctors, with a new technology, remove kidney stone without any intervention? Do they need to change the salinity within a kidney for the stone to melt within a few sessions? And now you understand why we tell you, volunteer. Do you want me to go to multinationals and tie your hand with research? Or do you want to do it yourself and help the others and our doctors to understand? We are not in medical practices. We are in elevation of the soul, how the soul decides to change the what we call dimension within dimension of physicality. And secondly, all these trials is done by the doctors. We are providers of the knowledge. So, if you want to see if it works, if it can bring a new understanding for us, volunteer. And opposite to the other researchers or doctors and institutions where they go out and look for billions to pay scientists to find out, KAKT Foundation asks you to pay for, as volunteer, for us to learn, for scientists to bring the new dimension.
Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.